In May of 1775, when John Hancock rose from his seat and walked slowly to the front of the chamber in Philadelphia, he was walking into a role that did not quite exist yet. The Second Continental Congress had reconvened under a new sky. Between its first and second sessions, there had been gunfire at Lexington and Concord, blood on New England grass, and British troops penned up in Boston by angry farmers turned soldiers. Peyton Randolph, the dignified Virginian who had presided the previous fall, was once again chosen as president, but he did not stay long. Affairs in Virginia and his own health pulled him home. When he left, the delegates had to decide who would hold the center of their improvised government. They chose Hancock, not just because he was available or because he was from Massachusetts, but because he had, by then, become a symbol. The tall, impeccably dressed merchant with the fine carriage and the air of practiced dignity was, in British eyes, one of the chief seducers of the king's subjects. In the eyes of many colonists, he was proof that a man with something to lose could still stand against imperial overreach. That transformation, from a young man of inherited wealth, tied to royal officials, to a leader of resistance, had not been inevitable. John Hancock was born in 1737 in Braintree, Massachusetts, into a family respectable but not grand. His father was a minister in the Congregational Church, a man whose authority rested more on moral force and letters than on land or ships. John was still a boy when his father died. The loss uprooted him, but it also opened a strange door. He was taken in by his uncle, Thomas Hancock, a childless merchant in Boston whose business connected New England to the wider British Empire, importing manufactured goods, exporting fish and whale oil and timber, scraping profit from every crossing of the Atlantic. Thomas lived on Beacon Hill, in a house whose comfort and display were worlds removed from the parsonage in Braintree. In that household, John grew up as heir to a different kind of pulpit. As a teenager, he attended the Boston Latin School and then Harvard College, where he studied the classics and theology, but also acquired the habits of a young gentleman in training. Polished manners, a sense of his own worth, a taste for fine clothes and easy company. After graduation, he entered his uncle's counting house. There he learned to read the language of ledgers, to understand credit and risk, to navigate the delicate world of colonial trade, where success depended not only on shrewd buying and selling, but on personal relationships with customs officers, governors, and other merchants. Thomas Hancock was no rebel. His fortune depended on the imperial system functioning tolerably well. He held contracts to supply British troops and maintained cordial relations with royal governors. John, as his protege, stepped easily into that world. When Thomas died in 1764, John inherited not only a vast estate, including houses, warehouses, ships, and investments, but also his uncle's position as one of the most prominent men in Boston. Overnight, the orphaned minister's son became a colonial magnate with a fortune that could buy carriages, servants, imported luxuries, and political influence. This background made his later role as a revolutionary leader more complicated than the simple story of the oppressed rising against their masters. Hancock was not oppressed in any conventional sense. He owned property, including enslaved people in his household. He had every reason, on paper, to preserve the imperial order. Yet he lived in a port city where the friction between London and the colonies was becoming impossible to ignore. The Sugar Act, and then the Stamp Act, cut into merchant profits and violated long-standing assumptions about self-taxation. Boston's small geography and dense politics meant that men like Hancock could not remain aloof. They saw protests in the streets, heard arguments in town meetings, watched as royal officers grew more arrogant under new instructions from across the sea. John's political apprenticeship was guided in large part by Samuel Adams, an older, less wealthy cousin who possessed far more revolutionary fervor and a genius for organization. Adams recognized in Hancock a useful combination: money, vanity, and a desire for respect. He cultivated their friendship, steering Hancock toward the cause of colonial rights. When the Stamp Act ignited protests, Hancock did not lead the mobs, but he funded and protected some of those who did. He began to show up at public meetings, lending the sheen of his name and fortune to resolutions that challenged Parliament's authority to tax the colonies. The episode that pushed him further from the imperial embrace was the seizure of his sloop Liberty in 1768. Customs officials, suspicious of smuggling, accused Hancock of unloading wine without proper duties. The case was legally murky but politically explosive. Crowds gathered, clashes occurred between townspeople and customs officers. British troops were eventually sent to occupy Boston. Hancock's ship became a symbol. To patriots, the seizure was an act of arbitrary enforcement aimed at a man who had refused to play the old game of discreet bribes and quiet compliance. To royal officials, the resistance to the seizure was evidence that men like Hancock were lawbreakers cloaking themselves in high-sounding words. Hancock's indictment for smuggling was eventually dropped, but the experience hardened him. The imperial system that had once seemed like a framework within which a clever man could thrive now looked more like a set of shackles tightened at someone else's whim. At the same time, his political star rose. He won election to the Massachusetts House of Representatives. He served as moderator of Boston town meetings, a role that required him to stand before crowds and keep order while they debated high-stakes questions of resistance and compliance. His voice, handsome presence, and generous hospitality made him a kind of popular aristocrat, admired by many, resented by some, and watched by all. The paradox of his personality is part of what made him memorable. He loved display. He rode in a fine carriage through streets where many walked barefoot, dressed in velvet and lace while speaking of liberty. Enemies mocked his vanity. Some allies rolled their eyes. Yet that same love of display made him fearless in some contexts. When British troops patrolled Boston, he did not hide. When threats circulated, he rarely shrank. He was, in a way, acting for an audience, partly the crowd, partly his own sense of an imagined posterity. That can be an unstable motive, but in crisis it can produce real courage. By the early 1770s, the imperial relationship was deteriorating fast. The Tea Act, designed to rescue the East India Company by giving it a monopoly, was seen in Boston as a Trojan horse. The destruction of tea in December 1773 provoked Parliament to pass the Coercive Acts, closing Boston's port and altering Massachusetts' charter. General Thomas Gage arrived with troops and authority. The colony's traditional forms of self-government were assaulted. In response, extra-legal bodies like the Massachusetts Provincial Congress emerged, claiming to represent the people in the absence of a legitimate royal government. Hancock became president of that Congress, an office that foreshadowed the role he would later play in Philadelphia. He presided over debates about militia organization, supply, and relations with other colonies. When British authorities listed Samuel Adams and John Hancock as the chief troublemakers to be arrested, they were acknowledging the shift. The wealthy merchant had become unmistakably a rebel leader. It was in this context that Hancock traveled to the Second Continental Congress in 1775. Lexington and Concord had already happened. In fact, one of the purposes of Gage's April march had been to seize arms at Concord and, if possible, capture Adams and Hancock, who were staying nearby in Lexington. Warned by riders like Paul Revere, they had fled before the troops arrived. The British soldiers who fired on militiamen that morning were, in a sense, chasing the shadows of two men whose political maneuvering had helped bring the crisis to that point. Arriving in Philadelphia, Hancock entered a room full of men who knew of him by reputation. To some, he was the flamboyant merchant patriot. To others, an unknown quantity from a troubled province. When Randolph left and Hancock was chosen as president, there was both logic and risk in the choice. Logic, because Massachusetts was at the center of the military conflict and needed its grievances taken seriously. Because a man so closely identified with one colony's radicalism might alienate moderates from others. Hancock's task, then, was to embody Massachusetts' urgency without letting its more incendiary impulses blow apart the fragile unity of the colonies. As president of the Continental Congress, Hancock occupied a role that straddled ceremony and function. He sat at the front, presiding over sessions, recognizing speakers, ruling on procedural questions. He oversaw the dispatch of letters and resolutions, signing them on behalf of Congress. Delegations from colonies and from abroad saw him as the human face of the rebel government. The title president sounded grand, but the actual authority attached to it was limited. Congress as a body made decisions, committees drafted documents, generals in the field made tactical choices. Hancock's influence lay in how he managed the flow of business and in the informal prestige he accumulated. During his tenure, Congress took decisions that would shape the war and the emerging nation. In June 1775, they appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. The choice was meant to signal unity, putting a Virginian at the head of troops then mostly drawn from New England. But it was also a move that recalibrated internal hierarchies. Hancock himself had fancied, at least briefly, that he might receive such a command. He had chaired the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, after all, and had presided over the appointment of generals in his home colony. His pride was bruised when Congress turned to Washington. Yet, to his credit, he swallowed that disappointment and performed the public rituals of approval, presenting Washington with his commission, hosting dinners, and trying, not always successfully, to maintain a cordial relationship. In the months leading up to July 1776, the work of Congress shifted from protest within empire to the possibility of separation. Hancock presided over debates that were both philosophical and intensely practical. Should the colonies declare independence before securing foreign alliances? Should they attempt one more petition to the king? How should power be organized in the interim? Delegates like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Richard Henry Lee took the lead in drafting and advocating for radical measures. Hancock, in the chair, created the space for these arguments to unfold. He was not the intellectual architect of independence, but he was the man who had to manage the tensions between cautious delegates who feared the consequences and those who believed delay would be fatal. When Congress finally approved the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776, Hancock signed the engrossed copy as president. The story that he wrote his name in large letters so that King George can read it without his spectacles may be apocryphal, but it captures something real about his theatrical streak. His signature, arcing boldly across the page, is not an act of modesty. It is a statement: I am here, and I am not afraid to be seen. It is easy to mock the vanity in that gesture. It is also easy to underestimate the danger of the moment. To put your name to that document was, in effect, to sign your own death warrant if the rebellion failed. Hancock, with more to lose than most in terms of property and social position, did it without hesitation. This is one of the key things he did. He lent his wealth and reputation to the cause at moments when the outcome was radically uncertain. He used his ships to transport supplies and munitions, sometimes at great personal risk. He opened his house and purse to officers and committees. He lent the office of Congress's presidency a certain glamour, hosting social events that wove bonds among delegates who might otherwise have remained wary strangers. He could be petty, irritable, and status-conscious, but he was also generous and accessible, a figure ordinary soldiers might see on the street and recognize. At the same time, his presidency revealed what he did not do, and perhaps could not. He did not shape war strategy. That domain was Washington's and his generals. He did not write the founding documents. Those tasks fell to others more comfortable with long hours at the desk and the subtleties of political theory. He did not solve the chronic financial crises that plagued Congress. The structural weaknesses of the Confederation and the reluctance of states to supply funds were beyond his ability to rectify. When things went badly, when armies went unpaid, when supplies failed to arrive, resentments rose. Sometimes Washington, exasperated by Congress, vented in ways that reflected on Hancock as the visible head of that body. Ill health also limited him. Hancock suffered from bouts of gout and other ailments that left him incapacitated for stretches. The grind of presiding day after day, of reading correspondence, of dealing with visitors, took its toll. By 1777, his effectiveness as president was declining. He grew tired of Philadelphia, tired of the criticism, tired of the distance from Massachusetts, where he still had property and political interests. In October of that year, after more than 2 years in the chair, far longer than any of the earlier presidents of Congress, he resigned and returned home. Back in Massachusetts, he reinvented himself again, this time as a state leader, rather than a continental one. He was elected to the Massachusetts legislature and, more importantly, became the state's first governor under its new constitution in 1780. In that role, he had more direct executive power than he had ever wielded in Philadelphia. He could appoint officials, influence legislation, and shape the tone of politics in a state ravaged by war and economic disruption. As governor, Hancock cultivated a populist image despite his wealth. He made a point of attending public celebrations, of pardoning debtors, of siding rhetorically with farmers and artisans against abuses by elites, even when he was himself the embodiment of elite privilege. During Shays' Rebellion in 1786 to 87, when indebted farmers in western Massachusetts rose up against courts and tax collectors, Hancock was officially out of office, having resigned due to ill health. His successor, James Bowdoin, took a hard line, calling out the militia to suppress the rebels. Hancock watched from the sidelines as the conflict exposed the deep strains in post-war society. When he returned to the governorship soon after, he favored amnesty and leniency rather than prolonged punishment. Whether out of compassion or political calculation, he sensed that a new republic built on endless retribution would be brittle. His stance during the ratification debates over the federal constitution is another example of what he did and did not do. At first, Hancock was skeptical of the new framework. It concentrated power in ways that alarmed many who had just fought a war against centralized authority. Anti-federalists courted him as a potential ally. At the Massachusetts ratifying convention, he arrived late, walking with difficulty due to gout, wrapped in bandages. His presence electrified the room. His silence, at first, made people nervous. Eventually, he proposed a compromise: ratify the Constitution, but accompany ratification with recommended amendments. A Bill of Rights that would protect individual liberties and the powers of the states. This proposal helped tip the balance in favor of ratification. It was a moment of statesmanlike pragmatism, blending concerns about liberty with recognition that the Articles of Confederation were failing. Yet he did not become a national figure in the new federal system. He never sought the presidency of the United States. His health was too poor, and perhaps his appetite for the kind of grinding work that would have entailed had waned. His role remained regional, his influence strongest within the bounds of Massachusetts, where his name was woven into the texture of daily political talk. He was re-elected governor repeatedly, more out of habit and affection than out of any radical program. People knew what they were getting: a man who liked ceremony, who could be counted on to show up at the right times, to express the right sentiments, to sprinkle pardons, and to keep the state broadly aligned with the new federal order. Behind the scenes, the contradictions of his life remained. He continued to live comfortably, even opulently. His household, like many in New England of his class, included enslaved servants earlier in his life. Massachusetts moved toward the effective abolition of slavery through its courts in the 1780s, altered the legal status of such persons, but the moral record is not tidy. He never became an abolitionist voice. The liberty he championed in public speeches was firmly anchored in the rights of white property-owning men. Women, indigenous people, and black people remained largely outside the circle of his political concern. He died in 1793, at the age of 56, his body worn down by years of gout, kidney stones, and the cumulative strain of public life. Boston staged an elaborate funeral. Bells tolled, processions wound through the streets. Eulogies praised his patriotism and generosity. In death, as in life, ceremony wrapped him. The young republic, still figuring out how to honor its leaders without sliding into monarchical worship, used his funeral as a kind of rehearsal in Republican mourning. Looking back at his tenure as president of the Continental Congress, it is tempting to reduce him to his signature, that dramatic flourish on parchment that has come to stand for defiance. The mythologizing of that moment is understandable. A symbol needs a simple hook, but the reality of his contribution is more diffuse. He was, in essence, a bridge figure. He linked the colonial mercantile elite to the revolutionary movement, carrying money, legitimacy, and a certain theatrical charisma across that span. He gave the presidency of Congress a human face and a certain weight, even if the office itself remained structurally weak. He embodied the tensions between personal ambition and public duty, between love of display and genuine courage. What he did not do is also part of the story. He did not define the philosophy of the revolution. He did not reshape the design of institutions in the way that Madison or Hamilton did. He did not command armies with brilliance. He did not transcend his class and racial worldview to broaden the scope of the liberty he championed. In a sense, he exemplified the revolution's limits as well as its possibilities. It could turn a wealthy merchant into a rebel leader. It could create new forms of government. It could assert rights with novel boldness. But it did not, yet, dismantle the deeper hierarchies on which men like Hancock's status rested. Still, to dismiss him as mere ornament would be a mistake. Politics, especially in moments of founding, is not only about ideas and structures, it is also about symbols, about who stands where and who signs what. Hancock's carriage rolling through colonial streets, his presence in town meetings, his steady hand and galling vanity in the president's chair in Philadelphia. All these helped make the abstract cause of resistance feel embodied and real. For ordinary people, seeing a man of his stature side openly against the king altered their sense of what was possible. If John Hancock could risk his fortune and neck, perhaps their own smaller risks were not in vain. The long line of presidents that would follow, first under the weak Articles government, then under the stronger Constitution, would increasingly fuse symbol and power in a single figure. George Washington's presidency would show what it meant for a man to be both head of state and working executive. Hancock's presidency of Congress was a more limited thing, but it was part of the genealogy. He took a title that had, under Randolph and Middleton, meant mostly procedural authority and infused it with public presence and drama. The office he held was not yet the presidency Americans now obsess over, but it was one of the crucibles in which that later institution was imagined. In the end, John Hancock stands as a reminder that revolutions are made not only by the pure of heart or the giants of thought, but also by people whose motives are mixed. Proud men, ambitious men, men who enjoy being seen. He wanted to be at the center of things, and he was, in using that desire in the service of a cause larger than himself. He helped shape the early contours of a political world in which the figure at the front of the room, the one with the gavel and the signature, would always matter, even when the real work of power was being done elsewhere.